Everyone, I am happy to welcome those of you joining us for the first time, as well as our returnees on behalf of the Sisters of St. Joseph, whose support for Spirit Alive makes these programs possible. My name is Sister Maria Pascuzzi. I am the director of Spirit Alive. We are very grateful for your participation and pleased that you could join us tonight for this fourth webinar presentation in our sexuality and the sacred series. Before I introduce our distinguished presenters, please bear with me, as I always do, start with a few announcements. So tonight's webinar, as are all of our presentations, is being recorded and will be posted on the Spirit Alive YouTube page or YouTube channel. Usually takes 48 to 72 hours for our tech Matthew to post the recording, so please be patient. You can access the recording by going to your browser and typing in CSJ YouTube, CSJ Spirit Alive YouTube, and it'll come up, or you can go to the Spirit Alive homepage and press the recordings button, and it will take you right to the YouTube library. Once the presentation is posted, it stays there. If you'd like to have closed captioning, please look around on your device, whether you have a laptop or an iPad, find the CC letters, and then you will be able to have text available on the screen. If you have questions, please feel free to submit them anytime during the presentation in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen if you're using a laptop. And our presenters will together try to answer as many questions as possible at the conclusion of their presentation. And finally, if you like our programming, please show your appreciation by donating online at Spirit Alive, or alternately, you can send a check made out to Spirit Alive, and the address is on our website. But now, I have the honor of introducing tonight's presenters. If you attended Spirit Alive's inaugural webinar series, you will remember Cristina Traina, who we welcome back to Spirit Alive tonight. In 2020, after a 30-year tenure at Northwestern University, Professor Traina came to Fordham University, which is here in New York, where she holds the Cardinal Avery Dulles Chair in Catholic Theology. Her research focuses on critical and constructive Christian feminist ethics, but she has a number of additional areas of expertise, too long to name, just suffice it to say they span the field of ethics, including the construction of gender. Cristina is joined tonight by Dr. Charles Bouchard, a Dominican friar and moral theologian who specializes in Catholic healthcare ethics, governance, sponsorship, and transgender health. He was professor and president of the Aquinas Institute of Theology in St. Louis before serving as vice president for theological education at Ascension Health. From 2015 until his retirement in 2023, Dr. Bouchard was director of the Catholic Health Association of the United States. He continues to work with church leaders and bishops here in the U.S. and in Rome on a range of issues involving healthcare, social justice, public policy, and the church. We're grateful to both of these very busy people for joining us tonight. And Charlie's way out on the west coast of Canada doing some presentations, so we're grateful to both of you. We are honored to have both of you here with us tonight to take a deeper look at the debate on gender and consider its theological and practical pastoral implications. So thanks very much. And I think, Cristina, we're handing over to you.
I think actually Charlie's going to begin.
Oh, okay.
And we'll go from there.
Okay, well, thanks for the introduction. And I'm very pleased to be here with Cristina this evening in order to share with you what I've learned about the transgender experience. My knowledge about this comes mainly from healthcare, so this may be a little bit more clinically oriented than you're used to. I have to say, a disclaimer, I am not a doctor, but I do watch a lot of doctor shows on television, so I feel I have some particular expertise in that area. My work with the Catholic Health Association when I was there led us into a 6-year dialogue with the U.S. bishops on the questions revolving around healthcare for trans persons. Eventually, that work resulted in the document which they issued in March of 2023. And it's maybe not in all ways what we had hoped for, but it's a beginning. I would say to start with that when we're talking about these questions of gender and sexuality, we are remembering that we are sexual beings. We might say that we have sex, but we are sexual. Sex defines us as male or female, or perhaps somewhere in between. It is a biological and genetic reality. We know that sex is instrumental to procreation, but it is also a kind of self-speaking. You know, when the church talks about the unitive and procreative dimensions of sex, it means, yes, it's used to create a family, but it's also used as a symbolic and real expression of mutual love, which is generative. The other thing that's important, I think, is to remember that our bodies and sex are also revelatory. We don't have time to go into it tonight, but the Catholic understanding of grace is one that allows grace and our human persons to be integrated. And so we, through our own bodily experience, have an experience of God and of grace. There's a wonderful book by Luke Timothy Johnson, who is actually a scripture professor. I think he's at Duke University, called The Revelatory Body. And that book was a real eye-opener for me in terms of paying attention to God's revelation through bodily existence. He says it's based on the fact that the incarnation was God's most definitive revelation. And therefore, we have to think seriously about our bodies in terms of what God speaks to us. Gender, and Cristina is going to say much more about this in a moment, but gender is a more nuanced reality than sex. It is, rather than just a biological experience, an inner awareness of how we are male or female, or again, somewhere in between. And as you know, there are wide expressions of what is male or, quote, female. Some are conventional and familiar and socially acceptable, others less so. And we're seeing a great expansion in diversity of gender roles and of gender identities today in our society, which is part of the discussion we'll have this evening. For most of us, gender and our birth sex coincide, but for a small number of people, there is an experience of discordance between sex and gender. And this is what we refer to as transgender. And I'm going to briefly share my screen with you just to take a look at some very basic terminology. I don't want to insult anybody, but I know that you're coming from different places. So let me just quickly run through my understanding of some of these fundamental terms. One of them would be the term gender incongruence. And I would say that that is the condition, a permanent condition in which the gender identity of a person or their own self-experience as male or female does not align with the sex that they were assigned at birth. Gender dysphoria, on the other hand, and again, this is my understanding. I've talked to a lot of trans people about this. Some of them have some issues with it, but I would say that gender dysphoria from a healthcare perspective is a symptom of gender incongruence. It is the unhappiness, the pain, and the trauma arising from the experience of that lack of congruity between sex and gender. And of course, gender, transgender, and cisgender simply mean across or on the same side, even though cis is not a very common prefix in English. Another thing that we could talk about would be the language about trans male and trans female, which when I first got into this was always confusing to me. Basically, a trans female is a person who was born a male but transitions to be a female. Similarly, a trans male is someone whose goal is to be male both in gender and in sex. There is another category here called intersex. And again, Cristina will say more about this later. But this is a different thing in many ways because it describes persons who are born with physical characteristics of both sexes. And when I give talks about this to medical groups, especially nurses, I ask how many of them have seen births with intersex characteristics, and usually most of them have. It's not common, but it's not uncommon either. Sometimes the ambiguity of the genital sex is so severe that it's hard to tell at birth. And other times it's relatively minor and can be easily corrected with surgery. But this is different from transgender, although in my opinion, these are both the result of prenatal hormonal influences. Now, people often ask, well, where does this come from? We don't have a real clear answer about this, but everybody I talk to seems to feel that our sexual and gender identity is determined for the most part prenatally as the result of hormonal influences. The issue is that the sexual organs develop first embryologically under certain hormonal influences. The brain develops later, and of course, even into early childhood and teenage years. And that is also under the effect of hormonal influences. So it's theoretically possible that someone could be that their embryology could be influenced early on so that their body develops according to one sex, and that influences later in pregnancy could shape the brain or self-awareness in a different way. And I think this is my opinion, that these things are all on a spectrum, all the way from what we call intersex to transgender to homosexuality, depending on when the hormonal influence occurred and at one point in pregnancy. As I said, this is just a theory that I've picked up from my own reading, but we have a lot more to learn about that. Gender ideology, and I think we want to distinguish this from the medical condition of transsexualism. Gender ideology is the cultural and political trend or trends that says there is no essential connection between sex and gender is seen as a matter of choice or preference. I see this as largely the result of a kind of exercise of freedom, which is common in at least North American society, in which we feel that we have choice about almost everything in life. This idea of gender ideology is what most Catholic authorities have problems with. They would insist that we cannot choose our own gender, and I don't think transgender people would say that either. Those that I've talked to say, I say, well, when did you know you were transgender? And most of them have said, I knew it when I was very, very young, but I didn't know what to call it. A gender ideology, or kind of gender bending, as we sometimes refer to it, that's another story. That could be the effect of culture or personal choice. This is a definition of gender ideology from a woman, a Catholic writer, and she describes it here. I'm not going to read it to you, but she basically says it's a false belief system that one sex is self-created regardless of biology. It denies human nature, and so on. And again, I don't think any transgender person would say that they created this. They would say that it was a given that they discovered it or became aware of it, but they didn't create it. And those of you who are listening, who are yourselves trans, may want to comment on this later. And finally, one or two last things. There's a book which the Catholic Health Association published a few years ago, which is the transcripts of 5 talks that were given to the Doctrine Committee of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. And they were accounts from 2 transgender persons, 2 parents of transgender children, and a woman who has been a spiritual director for many, many years for trans persons, Sister Louisa DeRuin, who I'm sure many of you know. In this description here from one of the women who is the mother of a trans boy, talked about the early awareness in this child of his own male identity. He was born a girl. His mother wanted to raise him as a girl. And one day she announced, "I, a boy." And every mother said every nerve ending in her body went on high alert. And she says, "I was kind of freaked out by this." This young man is a teenager now. I think he's very well adjusted, but it just says that in many cases, we talk about late onset gender dysphoria. The symptom may appear late, but I don't think the condition does. Lastly, there's another account in this little book, which you can find on CHA's website, from Dr. Colt St. Amand, who is a physician at Mayo Clinic. And he recounts being aware of his trans identity, that he was not a girl, but a boy. And then he says on Palm Sunday, he explains why he took the name Colt and how that was so fitting for him, that he realized when the gospel said that Jesus instructed the disciples to untether a colt, untie it and bring it, the Lord has need of it. Dr. St. Amand said, "I realized that the name I thought I had chosen for myself had been chosen for me. I was now untethered and living in the fullness of my truth. I was the colt liberated by Jesus' request, and he has need of me." And I'll come back to this a little later when we talk about spirituality. So, Cristina, I will turn it back to you at this point.
Thanks so much, Charlie. That was a terrific introduction. And thank you for clarifying the terms for us. I want to go back to the question of why is it then that Catholics are anxious about gender and gender identity? And one of the reasons is a document that was recently released about 4 years ago by the Congregation for Catholic Education called Male and Female, He Created Them. Some of you may have seen quotes from this or may have read bishops' policies that quote it. The context is that the CCE has a tradition of writing really thoughtful documents, helping schools create communities of respectful dialogue around a lot of issues, especially, for instance, interreligious dialogue and religious difference within the schools. And this document was designed to do originally the same thing, to ask how should Catholic schools approach gender incongruent and intersex and trans children and their families. Except that this did not follow the normal pattern of such documents. As in the Synod, these documents usually say, begin by listening, and then reason, and then propose, right? But in fact, in this document, they skipped the listening step and went straight to a gender theory analysis of cultural trends. So it's not surprising that they unfolded a doctrine of current Catholic teaching on sexuality that does not reflect the information that you just received from Father Charlie about how people's gender identity develops. It says, quote, "The Christian vision of anthropology," that means a theological description of the person, "sees sexuality as a fundamental component of one's personhood. It is one of its modes of being, of manifesting itself, communicating with others, of feeling, expressing, and living human love. Therefore, our sexuality plays an integral part in the development of our personality and in the process of education. Absolutely true. But then in this document, it says that our creation as male or female bodied people comes with spiritual, social, intellectual, and emotional differences that correspond to our bodies. We literally have different natures as men and women. And part of our religious vocation, the document says, is to live into this difference that God has created so that we are attracted to and completed by someone who is our complement, who is radically different from us, who is our opposite sex, right? So that together we have the full set of human, personal, spiritual, psychological resources and qualities that we need to be good partners and parents, and especially to model proper sex roles for our children. And it says, and this is where it gets very difficult and painful for transgender people and intersex people, denying this is denying foundational Catholic beliefs about God's creation and about God's intention for our lives. And denying it will inevitably create chaos in society because it denies and opposes the human nature that underlies family, which is the building block of our social world. Well, transgender identity does seem to challenge the idea that our bodies were created good. It does seem to challenge the idea that there's anything important about our physical bodies. It's taken the Roman Catholic Church, about 700 years since, or 800 years since Thomas Aquinas, to come back around to the idea that the body is a good thing. We don't really want to get rid of that, right? So it's a real question. If our souls and our bodies are a deeply connected unity, how can we possibly think about making any sort of distinction between our body sex, which clearly was created, and our sense of who we are socially and spiritually? Wouldn't that be denying God's gift, right? Wouldn't trans people be denying the unity of body and soul? Well, unlike the authors of Male and Female, He Created Them, let's listen to a couple of trans people before we decide about that. One, I'm going to read from a blog called Catholic Trans, which Matthew is going to give you the link to later on. This is from a person who said, my body and soul did not begin to feel coordinated and unified until after I started my physical transition. This is what she says. Now I'm a year into my physical transition, and the hormones alone have completely changed my experience of myself. My entire reality, body, mind, and soul are vastly more integrated. I actually experience the world through my senses and not always through the intermediary of my previously dissociated mind. It's a difficult experience to describe what it meant to feel disconnected from my body. But this decomposition was at one point my daily experience. It was only after I began my transition and experienced a more normative embodiment that in hindsight, I could fully appreciate the abnormality of my former condition. As I've grown into my own skin, I've developed a deeper appreciation for my physicality. From my own lived experience, I can only conclude that physical transition is efficacious, and its full efficacy only makes sense if we believe in the unity of the body and soul. The fact that my soul and body no longer clash like warring nations, that instead it's now difficult to tell where one begins and the other ends. This is not a story of dualism. It's a story of incarnation. It's a story of integration. It's above all else a story of redemption. At first, she finally felt that her body and her soul and her mind were one. Next, we want you to hear from Hilary Howes and her wife Celestine Howes and their daughter Alethea Howes, speaking from their own experience about being a trans family. Matt, if you could play that now, it would be great.
It's important for other people to hear the stories of those who are not like them, and to understand that in reality, we are like them. We are human. We are part of the advancement of society. We are part of everyday life. If someone else out there, and this part of this comes from my background, if one person out there watches this and feels better, or is saved, or has a purpose, suddenly goes, oh, well, wait, there's somebody out there like me, then that's important. My mother, who is a very spiritual person, always said that we can't change the world, but we can change the person in front of us. We can help that person, and from that person, it spreads out. So I believe that if there's one step I can take to help even just one person understand they're not alone, they're not on the outside, they are part of this world, this church, because this Catholic means universal, that's important for me to do.
And for me, I think it's important that people see that a family as strange as ours is still very happy and still very well adjusted, and that, you know, especially for the LGBT youth who think that, you know, their life is never going to get better or they're never going to be accepted, this is showing them that that's not true, that you can have a very happy, loving family, that you can be in an accepting church. I think that's very important that people know that.
So for me, really the importance of being here is to put a face to these terms. I mean, many people have heard about transgender people, and we see images in the media, and it can get pretty sensationalized. As much as we say we're different, we're also a very normal family. And in some ways, that kind of normalcy, I think, needs to be shared. In many ways, it's as hard to be Catholic in the transgender community as it is to be transgender in the Catholic community. There's a lot of sort of suspicion and wonder and question from sort of both sides. And I think being here and being out about being Catholic and being transgendered is important. So I think that's what really brought us here, to make a difference in terms of that, and make a difference for the church, to help it continue to be relevant in the 21st century. They're going to need to find a way to build some acceptance in, and so we like being that bridge.
One of the things that I think is crucial to the church and to the life period is that there is God in each and every person, and God created all of us. Anything that is created, God loves. Therefore, if God loves everything He's created, that means God loves everyone and everything. He doesn't create things that are to be discarded or to be reviled. If God created you that way, God created you that way for a reason, and therefore, and loves you for that. So to put anyone, any group of people into this is a group that God hates, is wrong. It's not biblical. It's not Christian. It certainly is not something Jesus did. Jesus reached out constantly to the layers of society, to people that other people hated. He constantly went to them. Prostitutes, tax collectors who were really bad in the Israeli world, fishermen, shepherds, lepers, anyone who did not fit in the upper stratas of the Hebrew society he was in, he went to them. He reached out to them. He lived with them. And if we can't live that way, then we're not being Christian.
Thanks so much, Matthew. You've gotten a sense of what it feels like to live in a family after transition in the Catholic Church, and some of the challenges people face. Father Charlie is going to talk about some of the challenges that arise also in the healthcare system around gender and transgender and intersex.
Okay, thank you again, Cristina. I'm going to just address some of the ethical questions that we dealt with. You know, in healthcare, we could probably make a list of about 50 of them. But in fact, it seems to me that from the church's perspective, there is one great big ethical question, and that is whether the transgender experience is new information about what it means to be human, at least new to us, you know, in terms of how we generally acknowledge it, or is transgender experience or the reality just a fad or an ideology, as we discussed it earlier. This is very important because a lot of people who are resistant to integrating trans people into society or the church maintain that this is just an ideology, a fad, which I mentioned earlier. But if in fact it is new scientific information, that changes everything. Because for us as Catholics, there is only one truth. There is a truth revealed by God. There is a truth that we find in science. There's a truth that we find in human experience. And ultimately, there is one truth. So if we discover, which I believe we have, that transgender experience is really a true and authentic expression of human existence, then we are going to have to somehow reevaluate our theological understanding of what it means to be a person. I remember once when I was speaking to a group of physicians at a hospital. It was actually in a rural area in the upper Midwest, fairly small town. And the hospital didn't even have a resident endocrinologist. They had an endocrinologist who came twice a week, I think. But they had a kind of team meeting about their trans patients because some of them had been hospitalized and so forth. So I talked about the evidence and I cited some scientific studies. And one of the physicians said to me, "Father, I am so glad that the church takes science seriously." And I thought, this is very unfortunate that we have given people the impression that we don't take science seriously or that we place it in competition with scripture and revelation. Now, I don't underestimate the difficulty of, bringing those two things together, but that's the task that we're facing right now. And we have a very clear, what we call anthropology, understanding of the person, which Cristina referred to. It comes up in the Vatican document as well, even more so in the U.S. Bishops document, which is very, and not particularly helpfully, metaphysical and philosophical in its approach. But it does articulate how we understand the unity of body and soul and so forth. But we are going to have to rethink that if we agree that there is scientific proof of this having some kind of organic basis, this experience, which, as I said, I believe I do. It does. It would also lead us to the conclusion that human sexuality is far more complex than we thought. Now, anybody who has worked in marriage and family counseling, or if you've been in any kind of pastoral ministry, you probably already know that. But when we talk about the binary, that is the norm for most of us. That probably is not going to go away as normative for the most part, but the transgender experience is going to teach us that there are variations. And the question for us is, are these acceptable variations in human sexuality and what it means to be a person or not? And then the next step ethically will be to make determinations about what kind of treatments are appropriate, everything from psychotherapy to hormone therapy to different kinds of surgery. And no one journey for trans people is the same. Some of them avail themselves of all those treatments. Some of them only therapy and social roles. Some of them only hormones. It depends. The journey is different for everyone. But medical science has to move toward a consensus on the effectiveness of various treatments and the situations in which they should be applied. We are dealing ethically, I think, with 4 different levels of ethical questions. One is the personal level, individual transgender people and their families, how to think about this ethically and spiritually. The second level is clinical. As I mentioned, the question of treatments, assessment, diagnosis. The third one is cultural. And the fourth one, unfortunately, is political. And the political fights about these things have made the whole question more difficult, especially in some states. And it makes it hard even for clinical providers to stick with the science because they get boxed in by politicians who are trying to use gender ideology as a wedge to separate people. Cristina, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks so much. We want to, I'm conscious of the time. So I might say a few things more quickly than I was originally planning, but as Father Charlie has said, there are a lot of open questions, and the scariest ones for most people are really the cultural ones. What is life going to look like? And they sometimes put people on in alliances that you would not expect. For instance, there's the question of whether a school should notify parents if a child has decided to start using a different name or different pronouns. You'll see that I put pronouns in my box, right, for Zoom at school. And the idea is that the school should not tell the parents, at least not right away, because the parents might then treat the child violently or reject the child or try to convert the child or punish the child for this. But the question is, what if the parents actually want to collaborate with the child? What if the parents want to help the child? What if the parents understand what might be going on and want to learn more? That's one of the big questions we have. We've got questions over marriage, right? What gender are you for the purpose of getting married? Does that need to be the one that was originally on your birth certificate? That's a question in some places where same-sex marriage is not allowed. And it's especially a question in the Catholic Church, right? If we need to be marrying a man and a woman, are you a woman because you became a woman, or are you a woman because you were born a woman? There's also the question of how early with children we should start target sex hormones or surgeries. People are very cautious there because those are, in many cases, irreversible changes that a child might regret later on. Although there's a fair amount of agreement that hormones that delay puberty might be very helpful because they give a child time to discern whether they're going through a period of anxiety over a gender or whether their sense of gender dysphoria really is permanent. These are things that we're still trying to figure out. Another element of this is intersex, because many times people, for instance, with androgen insensitivity syndrome have XY chromosomes, but present as female. or very nearly female, right? And very often in these cases, parents and doctors made decisions about how to raise a child who then goes through puberty and begins to feel as though that they are a member of the opposite gender. These can be very tricky, and intersex activists are asking that we please not do surgery on intersex babies that is not medically necessary until they have a chance to grow older and discern their own gender. So those are some of the questions we're dealing with. The puzzle that trans and intersex raise for us with gender is that trans people are very clear. There's a close connection between their bodies and their spirits, between their bodies and their minds. They're leaning in to gender and sex difference, not leaning away from it. Yet there are many other gender variations or gender differences that are not as extreme as trans or intersex. For instance, scientists are learning that what we thought were gender-linked differences in our brains are often a function of what we spend our time doing. For instance, full-time dads develop brains that resemble very closely those of full-time moms, which we thought were female brains, right? It turns out they're parenting brains. Other gender characteristics are socially generated. We're used to thinking of competitiveness and aggressiveness as masculine traits, but we live in a patrilineal society traditionally. In some matricentric societies, competitiveness is considered a feminine trait, not a masculine trait. And finally, even Catholic teaching on gender changes over time, even though some people will try to tell you that it doesn't, in response to human experience and cultural change. In the Middle Ages, the idea was that women were less rational and therefore less human in some sense than men, and therefore should be subordinated to them. And today, even under John Paul II, we have the idea that men and women are equal in the eyes of God and should have equal status in society. So gender is at base probably a mystery, something that we will not understand until we see God face to face. Charlie, you wanted to talk a little bit about spirituality in that respect.
Yes, Cristina, you gave a very good overview, a lead up to this. You know, as I mentioned, most of my experience has been dealing with clinical providers who are dealing with trans patients, either those who are seeking transition or those who had transitioned but arrived at a doctor's office or a hospital for something else, because trans people get broken arms, broken legs, heart attacks, cancer, just like, you know, the rest of us. So we were dealing with that on two different levels. But I think what happened, or I don't know if it happened, but we were mostly aware of trans people as medical specimens and as maybe objects of medical curiosity and scientific, you know, as clinical cases. And I think we did not until recently take account of the fact that trans people have spiritual needs as well. My fairly limited experience of meeting trans people has suggested to me, and maybe it's just because of the circles I moved in, but that they have very profound spiritual lives. I think that many trans people have had to face questions of God's providence. You know, sometimes we go through a difficult period and we say, oh, why, God, why are you doing this to me? Or a trans person could say, God, why did you make me this way? Now, that is a far more profound question about self-identity, about God's promise or providence, about God's call for me than I have ever had to answer. I mean, I've had some serious ones, but not at that level. And I think that kind of questioning, in addition to being isolated or sometimes alienated from family and friends and from society, have sharpened the spiritual awareness of at least the trans people that I know. Sister Louisa, who I mentioned earlier, has been a spiritual guide to trans people for 25 years. She said that somebody told her that she probably knows more trans people than most trans people know. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's true. And I would not presume to try to summarize her experience. But from what I have learned from her, it's true. There is a deep yearning for spirituality, for God, for a grasp of God's grace in their lives. You know, the interview with Hillary a few moments ago that Cristina showed was a great example, not just of struggling to be a family, but struggling to find God and to find grace in this experience. If it's a perverse choice, well, you know, there isn't going to be a whole lot of possibility for genuine spirituality. But if it's a given that we have to learn, or that trans people have to learn to accept as an expression of God's providence, that's a whole different thing. I mentioned also that quote, or I read to you that quote from Dr. Saint Amand from Colt, Dr. Colt, and his experience and his yearning for the Eucharist, which he talks about elsewhere in his testimony, which he gave to the U.S. bishops. Again, that deep sense of spirituality, and how do I fulfill that? I talked to a young trans man. I'm teaching healthcare ethics right now at Aquinas, and I had a young trans man come in and meet with the class last week. And he was telling us, describing his own journey as discovering God's plan for him, and, you know, didn't underestimate the difficulty. But then he happened to mention in passing that when he decided to come out as trans, he had served as an adult acolyte at one of the big churches in St. Louis. And he said, one of my big fears was that they were not going to let me be an acolyte anymore if I transitioned and announced it. So again, it speaks to the deep spiritual sensitivity and the need to be part of a Eucharistic community, to be an active member of that. So I think I would also recommend, finally, in this discussion of spirituality, the writings of the Whiteheads, Evelyn and James Whitehead. Unfortunately, they're both deceased now, but they did some very early writing on spirituality and for transgender persons. Another author is someone by the name of David Albert Jones, who is in Great Britain. But he has written an article entitled Faithfully Transgender with Claire Jenkins, and that appears in the Pastoral Journal. And they sketch out in there some basic elements of trans spirituality and how this is to be dealt with on an ecclesial basis. Cristina.
Thanks for that. Just in general, I think I would say that many LGBTQ members of the LGBTQ community, that certainly applies to me, have found coming out and coming to terms with ourselves one of the most profoundly spiritual experiences and one of the most spiritually freeing experiences of our lives, right? And I think Father Charlie has showed how that really can be especially true for trans people. The other side of spirituality that we must deal with if we're going to be compassionate companions to everyone in our communities is the spirituality and religious anxieties of people who are cisgender. Because to understand transgender people, intersex people, all people in the LGBTQ plus community is to have one's whole life, all of one's assumptions about how things go, called in question. These worries and discomforts are rooted in real theological problems about God's intent, right? And to have for cisgender people to have trans, non-binary, intersex people injected into their community upsets the binary apple cart. They don't know how to live life culturally, and they don't know how to live life in religious community. One of the best things that I have encountered on this is the Pressler lecture from earlier this year by Joy Ladin, who is a wise and compassionate trans Orthodox Jewish theologian and poet and literary scholar who has thought a lot about why so many religious people think of trans and non-binary identities as anti-religious and society destroying. It's because they're scared. They know that these identities will end social relations as we know them. They will destabilize all relationships that have traditionally been based on gender. Boy always meets girl, right? That's why they're scary. It changes gender for everyone. It's no longer solid, stable, obvious, even for cisgender people. You could always be otherwise. And that's why I have pronouns in the little box on the Zoom. We're used to being able to tell what gender someone is through just summing, sort of, looking at their outward appearance. With trans and non-binary identities, quite often gender is not immediately readable. People find this unsettling. Gender is one of those characteristics that they want to see in order to understand another person. This kind of reminds me of when my youngest brother, who is Black and whose one parent was Black, one parent was white. My younger brother was growing up. People always wanted to know, quote, what he really was, right? And he was called biracial, right? Because people could not decide, what am I looking at? Today, no one would ask that question. But in a society that depended on distinctiveness between races and difference between races, he was a very unsettling presence. So for us, we're used to great distinctiveness between genders. Someone who is ambiguous is dissembling, disheartening, just difficult for us to deal with. We're afraid of losing these identities and roles if we open the door to trans and non-binary and intersex identities. Well, Ladin says, how do we figure out how to make people more comfortable, how to deal with these anxieties? Maybe, she says, we don't go through our theology of sexuality. Maybe we look at more basic beliefs. For her, one of them is nature's basic incomprehensibility in the Jewish tradition. The idea that God builds miracles into the world just so that we cannot fully figure God out. And we have to be in awe of God's incomprehensible creativity. Or how about welcoming the stranger, which is also central for Judaism? The resident alien must be among you, but the resident alien will never be exactly like you. If you can't include that stranger, you can't include the ultimate stranger, who is God. Well, what might be some Catholic variations on this? I want to take a couple of ideas from the Synod document that came out, the interim document, sections 15 and 16, which deal with these kinds of questions. First one mentions Jesus's love, the truth of which Jesus is the bearer. It's not an idea, but the very presence of God in our midst, and the love with which he acts. It's not just a feeling, but the justice of the kingdom that changes history. What if this is the sort of love that we bring to loving the person who makes us uncomfortable or whom we don't understand? The other thing that this mentioned, and this is coming full circle back to Father Charlie's discussion of science, is communal discernment. The document says, we propose that initiatives enabling shared discernment on controversial, doctrinal, pastoral, and ethical issues should be developed in the light of the Word of God, church teaching, theological reflection, and an appreciation of the synodal experience. This can be accomplished through in-depth discussions among experts with diverse skills and backgrounds in an institutional setting that protects confidentiality and promotes frank discussion. When appropriate, it should also involve people directly affected by the matters under consideration. Such initiatives should be set in motion before the next session of the assembly. In other words, now, right away. We need to get people, scientists and psychologists and social workers and parents and children and trans people into rooms together to talk about these things. So the question I have for all of you is, what other tools and approaches might we have within our Catholic Christian tradition that help us think, pray, and discuss around these issues that maybe aren't based in our theological anthropology of sexuality specifically? Thanks so much for being with us tonight, and thanks so much for listening to two non-trans people talk about our journey with thinking about the issue of trans and speaking and learning from trans people.
And thanks for adding that qualification, Cristina. I always approach saying anything about this with some trepidation because, you know, we're outside that experience. So I hope that we have adequately represented the issues.
I just want to note that Matt has tossed some resources that we assembled into the chat, and it's a wonderful set of places for you to look if you want to listen to more of the interview or hear Joy Ladin's talk or see some other interviews or read other information. It's just a beginning.
So in the few minutes we have left, we promised we'd answer questions, and we have a few. So either of one of you would feel free. So person says, crazy question, but if an intersex person accepts the gender sex accepted at birth, then would that make them cis? For example, if doctors performed a procedure that positioned that person as predominantly female and the person later accepts that designation, could that then make them cisgender?
Yes. Yes, because their embodiment and their sense of themselves would be lined up.
And as Cristina said, it's very important, and we don't do this anymore, but we used to make very early decisions based on observation of genitals about whether this was a boy or a girl, and it wasn't always the right decision. So kids need time to grow up and express themselves.
And so I guess the same question went on to ask, or if an intersex person is determined as intersex at birth and accepts a non-binary identity, would that also be considered cis?
Father Charlie, I don't know how non-binary intersex people arrange themselves with respect to cis and trans. Do you know anyone who has shared that with you?
No, I can't say that I've ever talked to anyone about that. Yeah, I won't say anymore. I really don't have any helpful information about that.
Okay. Someone asks, some queer communities are currently rejecting the idea of, quote, born this way. How do we navigate this in a sensitive way if we are also bringing in the premises of science?
So I'm not sure I understand the question. Queer communities are rejecting the born this way in
Yes.
favor of what?
The person doesn't say they're simply rejecting it, but how do we navigate this in light of what we know from science?
Well, if what the questioner is getting at is how we deal with the question of choice of gender expression, which you may discover or change over time, that would be one thing. You might not be born that way, but express it in different ways through your life. I don't see that so much as a scientific issue as a cultural one. Christine, I'm not sure what you would say about that.
Right. The science, as you have said, Father Charlie, is evolving on this, and we are the very beginning of this process, right? The degrees to which science may reveal things in the future, we have no idea. I will say that in the 1970s and 1980s, there were many women who declared themselves politically lesbian because they wished to secede from patriarchal society, for instance. And so there are cases like that. There are also cases in some cultures in which many men who don't consider themselves to be gay will still have a certain period in their life where they do engage in same-sex relationship, in same-sex sex, right? So we also need to be aware that these titles of trans and intersex, gay, lesbian, non-binary, these are not scientific categories, but they're our Western, somewhat medical and psychological labels that we're currently putting on people who have some sort of who don't fit the I am cisgender and I am attracted to the opposite sex category, right? So these are labels and they have changed over time. We used to talk about gay women. You heard Hillary Howe's talk about being transsexual, even though people now say transgender. Right? These terms are always changing and they're not essential.
And there were other terms early on, which nobody would even ever speak today.
I think someone asked for a list of recommended readings of books, and I think some of those were already put in the chat box. Somebody else wanted a link to Joy Lattin's talk. Is that a possibility? Can we get a link to that, Joy Lattin's talk?
I added it below.
Okay.
Yeah, it's already there.
Matthew's put that in there. Let's go down to this question. How do people who are gender fluid fit into your understanding of the biological idea of gender dysphoria?
Personally, I would see that, now I'm speaking just from my outside experience, I see that as a different category. I think there are some people who have a broader ability to express and to live gender identity. I don't see that as directly related to transgender or the other categories that we talked about. I don't know that gender fluid people experience that dysphoria that leads to a diagnosis of gender incongruence.
Interesting.
In some cases, this is a desire not to be boxed in by the stereotypical emotional and actually sartorial, right? Presentations of masculinity and femininity. So very often these are people who are putting us on notice that no matter what their genitals may be, they can be assertive and compassionate. They can be rational and emotional, right? That they don't want to be limited to the stereotypical characteristics of one Western gender presentation.
Thank you. Someone comments, some queer people do support gender ideology in that it is a choice of gender identity and expression. How does that fit into what you said? Are you familiar with people who are queer and support gender ideology and say it is a choice?
Yes, I am. At least from, as I said, my perspective is largely from what I learned in healthcare settings. I think we have to distinguish gender ideology as a choice from a given, which may be, we don't know exactly why. But I would say it's kind of like someone who is not gay, perhaps, but who really wants gay people to have equal rights. But that's not the same as being constitutionally homosexual. That's another story, my opinion. Christine, I don't know how you would respond to that.
Right. I think it also depends on what we mean by choice. If you watch, Joy Ladin is unashamedly a trans woman who feels that she was always a trans woman. Okay. Right. Even though she transitioned physically later in her life because she was working at an Orthodox educational institution. But if you watch her video, you will see that she says that every morning one wakes up and one makes a choice of a kind. And for her, that's a choice of how one presents or calls oneself, right? Mm-hmm. And what's scary, she reminds us, is that even for cisgender people, right, we wake up in the morning, and I wake up in the morning, and because I know trans people, I now have to remember that I could have ended up being a trans man, but I'm not. I'm a cis woman, and so I'm going to use she, her, right? Which wasn't something you had to think about 40 years ago. Right. And so it depends on what you mean by choice as well.
I think the other question is that people who are making a choice about their gender identity or expression of gender are not going to seek medical help. The transgender experience means that this discordance is so painful that it can actually lead to suicide, and it needs to be treated. And I don't want to just lump those people together with others who are doing it for cultural or personal reasons, because some people really need medical help.
Before I ask the next question, two people have already mentioned that somehow in the chat box, they are not seeing the resources that have been put in. So Matthew, can you take a look at that and see what might be wrong there? And while Matthew is taking a look at that, how about this question? What about sports? How do we minister to, for example, a person who feels she is female with a male body and wants to play in women's sports, being that there are scientifically physical differences? And the person says, "Figure my writing, I'm still learning." But I think you get the gist of the question, yes? And there's a lot of conflict about this.
Charlie, you can probably address the medical side of this more. But this is another one of those unanswered questions that we're still working on. My understanding is, though, that very often if a trans woman has undergone hormone therapy, many of those advantages will disappear. Is that right, Father Charlie?
That's what I would say, yeah, because of the body changes that take place. I'd have to say that I taught high school one year and it was a disaster, and I was never very skilled athletically, so I'm not going to comment on this at all.
That makes two of us.
Yeah. I'd like to throw in a question before we wrap it up tonight. I'm a big Jeopardy fan, as I think a lot of people are here. Mm-hmm. And one trans person who has put a different face on trans is, of course, is this Amy Schneider, who was a star on Jeopardy and won so many games, and a delightful, lovely person, but is married to a woman. And I think one question that certainly comes into people's mind as a curiosity is, what is this dynamic wherein a man becomes a trans woman and then marries a woman. What do you call a trans person who has chosen then to marry a woman? Is that person, what is that person, a lesbian? And what is do you understand, have you met people who've done this, and what is the dynamic behind that? Because I think an ordinary cis person would say, well, if you wanted to marry a woman, why didn't you just stay as you were? So can we kind of get our heads around that a little bit?
In my experience, that person would call herself a trans lesbian, right? And in fact, I think that's what Hilary House would call herself, even though her wife Celestine would say, no. Celestine would say, no, in fact, I am not a lesbian, right? I am straight, but I happen to have married a man who became a woman, right? And I still love her, and I still want to be married to this person, right? But I am not a lesbian.
Yeah, and I think this just suggests the complexity of human sexuality that we are discovering and acknowledging. And it means that, gender identity and sexual identity or sexual preference can occur in different combinations. Cristina, as you were talking about our limited ability to tolerate ambiguity. I mean, I remember the first time I heard about one of these kind of situations, I thought, how can that happen? Well, I guess it can.
It can. And I think it's time to wrap up, but what you taught us tonight is way more can happen than we can imagine in our limited pea-sized brains. And I thought one of the most beautiful things came out of tonight that maybe we can all take away with us is that whole notion that maybe we have to transcend some of the reference points, you refer to our theological assumptions, and move to other possibilities. I mean, even in scripture, and that's my field, people go to a couple of texts when the text of the Bible is so rich with so many other ways of understanding who God is and how God acts in the world. God is not simply a God who believes in retributive justice, but a God who can transcend that and graces us with mercy and forgiveness that is completely unmerited. So I think you leave us with so much tonight, and I'm so grateful to both of you for joining us. And tonight, as I do in the other webinars and classes, I ask people just to pause for just a couple of seconds and pray for peace in the world. As we sit here tonight in the comfort of our own homes, people are dying, people are experiencing violence, people are losing everything that means everything to them in the world. And we need to pray not only for the peace of Jerusalem, but for peace to reign in human hearts and to replace vengeance and retribution, so that every human being can sit under his or her own fig tree and under his or her own vine and enjoy the peace that God wills for every human being. So thank you all. Thanks everybody for coming. It's 8:45. I'm sure there are going to be a million questions for you two that people are going to give me after the fact when they are writing to say how much they enjoyed this. So if you don't mind, I'm going to pass them on to you, because I don't know nothing about birth and no baby, as that lady said in Gone with the Wind. And I certainly don't know a whole lot about this. So good night, everyone who's there. And for those of you who'll be joining us by the video recording, we're glad that you were able to do that. You've enriched our lives, Cristina and Charlie. Thanks so much. God bless and good night. Thank you.
Welcome. Good night.